A young boy bursts through the doors of a quiet police station, his small frame trembling as he gasps for breath. His voice, shaky yet determined, rings out, startling everyone in the room. "Arrest my dad." The officers inside freeze, exchanging confused glances as they process the urgency in his voice. The boy, no older than 10, stands there, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something that no child his age should ever have to feel. The room falls silent, the weight of his words settling in. One of the officers, a seasoned sergeant with years of experience, steps forward. He kneels down, trying to meet the boy's gaze. "What's going on, son? Why do you want us to arrest your dad?" His tone is gentle, but there's a tension in the air, as if everyone knows that whatever this boy is about to say is going to be serious, maybe even life-changing. The boy bites his lip, glancing nervously toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. His hands are shaking now, and the officer notices. "Is your dad in danger?" "Are you?" The questions come quickly, but the boy shakes his head, his expression growing more intense. He looks directly into the officer's eyes, his voice a quiet plea. "No, but you have to stop him before it's too late." The officer frowns, not fully understanding. "Stop him from what?" The boy hesitates, glancing down at his feet as though he's unsure if he should continue. But then, as if finding some inner courage, he speaks. "My dad, he's not who you think he is. He's going to do something really bad. I don't want anyone to get hurt." His voice cracks, and his small hands ball into fists, a mix of fear and frustration taking over. The other officers, who had been quietly observing from behind their desks, now lean in closer, sensing that this is far from a typical call for help. There's something deeply unsettling in the way the boy talks, in the way his face pales as he mentions his father. The sergeant takes a deep breath, realizing this is no ordinary situation. He's seen a lot in his career, but a child walking into a police station asking for his own father to be arrested, there's something different about this. Something darker. "Listen, son," the officer says carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to know exactly what's happening, so we can help. Is your dad hurting someone? Is someone in your family in danger?" The boy shakes his head again, this time more forcefully. "No, not yet. But he's going to. He told me. He told me everything, and I don't know who else to tell." His voice rises with each word, and now it's clear that he's holding back tears. Okay, the officer says, holding up his hands in a calming gesture. "You're doing the right thing by coming here. We just need a little more information to help. What did your dad say?" The boy's lip trembles, and for a moment, it looks like he might not answer. But then he takes a deep breath, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He said he's going to hurt someone because of what they did to us. He blames them, and I know he's going to do something bad. I heard him talking on the phone. He doesn't think I know, but I heard everything." His voice trails off, leaving the room thick with tension. The officers are silent for a moment, digesting the boy's words. There's a deep undercurrent of something much bigger at play, something that could change everything. The sergeant looks at the boy again, this time with a new level of seriousness. "You did the right thing coming here, kid. We'll look into it. But first, we need to know who he's planning to hurt." The boy's eyes well up again, and he swallows hard before answering. His voice is barely above a whisper, but it cuts through the air like a knife. "It's not just one person. It's a lot of people. He's planning something big. You have to stop him." The words hang in the air, leaving everyone in the station frozen in place. The sergeant stands up slowly, exchanging a look with his fellow officers. This wasn't just a family matter. It was potentially something much more dangerous, something that needed to be dealt with immediately. As the boy stands there, looking small and vulnerable in the middle of the station, the weight of what he's just revealed begins to settle in. His father, the man he loves, the man who's supposed to protect him, is planning something terrible. And now it's up to him, a child, to stop it before anyone gets hurt. The sergeant turns back to the boy, his expression grim but determined. "We're going to help you. But we need to know everything you heard. Can you tell us?" The boy nods, wiping his eyes again. "I'll tell you everything. Just promise me no one will get hurt." The officer's heart aches as he looks at the boy. "We'll do everything we can," he says softly, though he knows deep down that this situation is far more complicated than a simple promise could fix. As the officers spring into action, gathering details and preparing to investigate, the boy's words echo in the sergeant's mind. He's planning something big. The sergeant knows they have to act fast, but there's still so much they don't know. And with every passing minute, the danger seems to grow. The boy sits quietly in the corner of the room now, his face pale and drained from the weight of his confession. He's done what he can to stop his father, but whether they'll be able to prevent the looming threat remains to be seen. There's a storm brewing, one that could change everything in their small town. And at the center of it all is a scared little boy trying to protect the world from the man who raised him. What exactly is his father planning? And can the police stop it before it's too late? The sergeant could feel the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. As he glanced at the other officers, he could see the same concern reflected in their eyes. None of them had expected their day to turn into something so serious. And now, it was a race against time. They had a scared boy sitting in their station, begging for help, and a vague but alarming warning about his father's dangerous plans. The stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. The sergeant motioned for the boy to follow him to a quieter part of the station, away from the hustle and bustle of the main floor. He led the boy to a small interview room, a place where they could talk more privately. The boy shuffled inside, still clearly shaken. He sat down in one of the chairs, his legs barely reaching the floor, and nervously fidgeted with his hands. The sergeant sat across from him, taking out a notepad. "Okay, buddy," the sergeant began, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "We're going to help you, but we need to know everything. Can you start from the beginning? Tell me about your dad. What has he been doing?" The boy hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the door, as if he expected someone to come in and stop him from talking. He finally took a deep breath and started to speak, his voice low. "My dad, he's always been different. He's been really angry lately. Not just at me or my mom, but at everyone. He says things about how people don't understand him, how they don't care about what happens to us. I thought he was just mad, like when people get upset. But then I started hearing him talk on the phone with people, strange people." The sergeant's pen moved quickly across the paper, taking down every word. "What did he say on the phone?" he asked, keeping his tone soft but urgent. The boy's hands were still shaking, but he pressed on. He was talking about doing something bad. "I don't know what exactly. But he said that he was tired of waiting for things to change, and that he was going to take matters into his own hands. He said it was time for them to pay for what they did." The sergeant frowned. "Did he say who they are?" The boy shook his head. "No, but I think he means the people in town. He's always complaining about the government, the police, the neighbors. He thinks they're all against us." I didn't want to believe he was serious, but then I heard him talking about a plan, a really bad plan. I think he's going to hurt a lot of people. The air in the room grew heavier as the boy's words settled. The sergeant could sense that they were dealing with something serious, more than just a man who was angry at the world. If what the boy said was true, his father might be planning something dangerous, something that could hurt not just one person, but many. This wasn't just a domestic issue anymore, it was potentially a threat to public safety. "Did your dad mention when he's planning to do this?" the sergeant asked, his voice tense with urgency. The boy nodded slowly. "I think it's soon. He's been acting really weird the past few days, like he's getting ready for something. He's been locking himself in the basement and not letting anyone in. My mom asked him what he was doing, but he just told her to mind her business. She's scared of him too, but she doesn't know what he's planning." The sergeant exchanged a glance with another officer who had quietly entered the room to listen. This was escalating quickly. They didn't have much time. If the boy's father was planning something dangerous, they needed to act fast to prevent it. "Does your dad have any weapons?" the sergeant asked carefully, not wanting to scare the boy, but needing to know the truth. The boy's face grew even paler, and he nodded. "I've seen him with guns. He has a few of them. He keeps them in the basement, hidden behind a bunch of stuff. I think he's been messing with them a lot lately. I'm scared. I don't know what he's going to do." The sergeant felt a chill run down his spine. Guns, a hidden plan, and an angry man with a grudge. This was a dangerous combination. They needed to intervene before this situation spiraled out of control. The sergeant stood up, motioning for the boy to stay seated for a moment. He stepped outside the room to talk with the other officers. "We need to move quickly," he said in a low voice, his tone grave. "This kid's dad is a real threat. He's got weapons, and the boy thinks he's planning something soon. We can't wait around for this to escalate." One of the officers nodded. "I'll put in a request for a warrant. We need to search the house, check the basement, and make sure there's no immediate danger." The sergeant agreed. "We'll need to handle this carefully. We don't want to spook the guy and make him act faster than he's planning. Let's keep this low-key until we know more." As the officers worked quickly to put the plan in motion, the sergeant returned to the room where the boy was waiting. He sat down again, trying to offer a reassuring smile, despite the gravity of the situation. "You did the right thing coming here," he told the boy. "We're going to look into this, and we'll make sure everyone stays safe. But I need you to help us with a few more details." The boy nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Okay, I'll help. I just don't want anyone to get hurt." The sergeant asked the boy more questions, gathering as much information as he could. They needed every piece of the puzzle to stop the boy's father before he could put his plan into action. The boy explained more about the conversations he had overheard, the strange phone calls his father had been making, and the cryptic messages he had seen on his dad's computer. It was clear that this was more than just a frustrated man venting his anger. There was a real tangible threat here. As the conversation continued, the tension in the room grew thicker. Every new detail the boy revealed seemed to raise more questions than answers. Who were these people his father had been talking to? What exactly was the plan? And most importantly, how soon was it going to happen? The sergeant's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. There was still so much they didn't know, and time was running out. He glanced at the clock, realizing that every minute they spent waiting could bring them closer to disaster. They needed to act, but they couldn't rush in blindly. They needed a plan. As the sergeant gathered the last bits of information from the boy, one of the other officers entered the room with an update. "We've got the warrant," he said quietly. "We're ready to move." The sergeant nodded, his heart pounding. This was it. They were going to the boy's house to confront his father and hopefully prevent whatever terrible plan he had in mind. But the stakes were high, and there was no room for error. One wrong move could set everything in motion faster than they could control. The sergeant turned back to the boy, giving him one last reassuring smile. "You're going to stay here at the station, okay? We'll take care of everything from here. You're safe now." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with both fear and hope. He had done everything he could to stop his father, and now it was up to the police to handle the rest. As the sergeant and the officers prepared to leave, the boy's words echoed in the sergeant's mind. He's going to hurt a lot of people. The sergeant couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whatever the boy's father was planning, they needed to stop it fast. And as they headed toward the house, sirens off and lights low, the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them all. Would they get there in time? Or was it already too late? Back at the station, the boy sat quietly, staring at the clock as the minutes ticked by. He had done what he could, but the fear still lingered in his chest. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Whatever his father had been planning, it wasn't good. And now, it was in the hands of the police. As the officers sped toward the boy's house, the air inside the car was thick with tension. The sirens were silent, and the flashing lights were off, an attempt to keep things as low-key as possible. The last thing they wanted was for the boy's father to catch wind of their approach. The sergeant's mind raced with every possible scenario. He couldn't help but wonder what exactly the man was planning. The boy's words were replaying in his head over and over. He's going to hurt a lot of people. They pulled up to the house, a modest two-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like any other house in the area. The lights were dim, and the quiet of the night seemed unnaturally calm. The officers exchanged a quick glance before stepping out of the car. This could go one of two ways. Either they'd walk in and stop whatever it was the boy's father had planned, or they'd find themselves in a far more dangerous situation than any of them were prepared for. As the sergeant approached the front door, His hand instinctively went to his radio. He didn't want to make any mistakes. He signaled to the officer standing by. "Keep your eyes peeled. Watch the windows. If he's inside, he might be watching us." The officer nodded and began scanning the house for any signs of movement. The sergeant turned to the other two officers and gestured for them to get into position. He reached for the doorbell and pressed it once. There was a long pause, and then the sound of someone shuffling inside the house. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked to be in his early 30s. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt. There was a tired, almost defeated look in his eyes, but underneath it all, the sergeant saw something else, something dark. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The sergeant didn't waste any time. He pulled out his badge and stepped forward. "We're here to speak with you. There's been a report about some concerning behavior, and we need to ask you a few questions." The man's eyes flickered with recognition, but he quickly masked it with a forced calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." The sergeant raised an eyebrow, trying to read the man's face. "Your son came to the police station earlier tonight. He's worried about you." The man's expression tightened, and for a brief moment, the sergeant could see the briefest flash of anger cross his face. "What did he say?" the man asked, his tone sharper now. "We need to come inside and talk," the sergeant said firmly. "It's for your safety, and for everyone else's." There was a long silence, but then the man stepped aside, allowing the officers to enter the home. The sergeant motioned for the others to follow him as they cautiously stepped into the dimly lit living room. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no sign of life, aside from the man in front of them. As the sergeant looked around the room, something caught his eye: a stack of papers on the kitchen table, a few scattered documents that looked as though they had been hastily thrown together. One of the papers was halfway visible, the words on it unclear, but showing hints of a plan, an organized blueprint of some sort. Before the sergeant could ask about it, the man spoke again, his voice low and shaking. "My son, he doesn't understand. He doesn't know what I've been through. He doesn't know what's at stake." The sergeant took a step closer, keeping his voice steady. "What's at stake, Mr. Lawson?" The man flinched at the mention of his name, as though it was the last thing he wanted to hear. "You don't know anything about me or my family," he muttered, his anger beginning to boil. "You have no idea what I've been through, what they've put me through." The sergeant's gaze sharpened. "Who are you talking about?" The man's hands trembled, but he clenched his fists, his face flushed with emotion. "The people in this town. They've been taking everything from me. They've been trying to ruin me, my family, my reputation. It's all falling apart. I've worked my whole life for nothing. They're the ones who are making me do this. I don't have a choice anymore." The sergeant's gut twisted with a growing unease. He had been expecting some kind of desperation from the man, but not this. "What exactly are you planning to do?" he asked, his voice hard but still controlled. The man's eyes darted around the room, as if he was weighing whether or not he should confess. For a moment, the sergeant thought he might not get an answer. But then, with a heavy sigh, the man let out a bitter laugh. "You think I'm just going to walk away, right? That I'm just a man who's had a rough patch? Well, that's not the case. This is bigger than you think." Before the sergeant could react, the man turned quickly and grabbed something from the table, one of the papers. He held it up, letting it dangle in front of the officers' faces. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his eyes wild. "This is the blueprint. This is the plan." The officers exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. The sergeant stepped forward, his heart pounding. "What plan?" he demanded. The man's hand trembled as he began to speak again, but this time, his voice was quieter. "It's not just about me. It's not just about the things they've done to my family. It's bigger than that. It's about exposing everything, the corruption, the lies. They've been hiding things from us for years. They've been controlling us, making us believe that everything's fine while they pull the strings behind the scenes. But I'm going to expose them all. I'm going to make them pay." The sergeant's mind raced as he processed the man's words. The town? Corruption? There was something far deeper going on here than he could have imagined. This wasn't just a man with a personal grudge anymore. This was something organized, something much larger. Was the man really planning to go through with it? And if so, what exactly was his plan? The implications were chilling. As the sergeant tried to absorb everything, something unexpected happened. The man's eyes flickered to the door behind the officers, and for the briefest moment, the sergeant saw a glint of fear flash across his face. Before he could turn around, there was a loud crash, the door to the house slammed open, and another figure stormed inside. The officers quickly raised their weapons, unsure of who this new person was. The man Lawson looked just as shocked, his face draining of color. "I knew you'd come for him," the new figure said, glaring at the officers. The voice was sharp, unmistakable. It was familiar. The sergeant's stomach twisted as he realized who it was. Standing in the doorway was none other than the boy's mother, the very woman who had been waiting at home, unaware of what was happening. But now, her expression was fierce, and her eyes were blazing with something the sergeant couldn't quite place. Was it anger? Fear? Or something darker? "You didn't think I'd let you come in here and take him, did you?" She spat, her voice trembling with rage. The sergeant stood frozen for a moment, trying to piece together what was happening. He had expected a confrontation with the father, but now it was clear that the situation was much more complicated than he had anticipated. The mother's sudden appearance, her hostility, everything was shifting. The boy had warned them, but no one could have predicted this. As the officers readied themselves, one question loomed large. What in the world was really going on here, and who was pulling the strings behind all of this chaos? The tension in the room escalated like a storm, about to break. The sergeant, now fully aware that this was far from a simple domestic situation, kept his eyes on the boy's mother. Her sudden appearance had turned everything upside down, and the way she was glaring at the officers spoke volumes. She wasn't just furious. There was an unmistakable sense of desperation in her posture, in the way she was clenching her fists. The sergeant took a careful step forward, trying to steady his voice. "Ma'am, we don't want to make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his hand still resting on his weapon, but not drawing it. "We're just trying to ensure the safety of your son and stop whatever your husband might be planning." But she wasn't hearing any of it. "Safety?" She scoffed. "Do you really think this is about safety? This is about control. It's about the lies they've been feeding us, the lies that my husband has been too afraid to expose until now." The sergeant frowned, trying to process her words. The mention of they was disorienting. Who exactly was she talking about? And why did it sound like she was siding with her husband, who was now standing in the corner, his eyes darting between the officers and his wife? Before the sergeant could ask, the boy's mother took a step forward, her voice trembling with fury. "You don't know what we've been through. You don't know what's really going on in this town." She was shouting now, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "We've been trying to warn everyone, but they've kept us silent. They've kept him silent." The sergeant exchanged a look with his fellow officers, his heart beating faster. There was a growing sense that everything they'd believed about this situation was incomplete, twisted by unknown factors. The boy, who had been hiding behind his mother, finally spoke. His voice was small but filled with urgency. "Mom, he's not the bad guy. He's just trying to protect us. He didn't mean to." "Enough!" the mother snapped, cutting him off. Her eyes darted toward her husband, as if she'd suddenly remembered something crucial. He wasn't supposed to find out. He wasn't supposed to know what we've been planning. The sergeant's mind raced. What were they talking about? What plan? Had the boy been kept in the dark, or was he part of this strange scheme? He turned back to Lawson, the father. "Sir, what is she talking about? What's really going on here?" Lawson's eyes, already wild with anxiety, widened even more as he struggled to come to terms with the gravity of the situation. He looked like he might break down at any moment, but instead, his expression became more resolute, almost defiant. "We had a plan," he said, his voice low. "But it wasn't about hurting people. It was about survival." The sergeant's pulse quickened. "Survival from what?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The father hesitated, his eyes shifting toward his wife, then back to the sergeant. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were just trying to keep our son safe. But the system, it's broken. We couldn't trust anyone anymore. Not the government, not the schools, not even the neighbors. Everyone's been bought off. We were going to leave, but now they know we know. The sergeant's heart sank. He was beginning to piece together the fragmented narrative, but it made less and less sense the more he heard. "You're talking about some kind of conspiracy," he murmured, his mind racing. "But where does it lead?" Before the father could answer, the mother interrupted again, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's not just a conspiracy," she said, her eyes wild with the weight of years of fear. "They've been watching us. They've been manipulating us. We were going to expose them, and we still can, but now it's too late. They've already found out we know too much. We were going to leave the town and go somewhere safe, but now they've cornered us." The sergeant was beginning to understand, but there was still one major thing that didn't make sense. If they were planning to leave, why had the boy come to the police station yelling that his father was dangerous? Why had he been so terrified? As the sergeant pieced together the fragmented information, something clicked, a realization that turned his stomach. He looked between the boy, his parents, and the papers on the table. The blueprint. The plans. It wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about what the father had been preparing for. Suddenly, the boy spoke up again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom. Dad, what did you do?" There was a long pause, filled only by the distant hum of the air conditioning. The room fell deathly silent. The mother's eyes locked with the boy's, and then she slowly turned back to the sergeant. "We didn't want to hurt anyone," she said, her voice shaking. "But they left us no choice. We found out too much. They've been covering up crimes, running things behind closed doors, making deals that no one knows about. And when we tried to expose it, they threatened us. So we had to make sure they couldn't stop us before we left." The sergeant felt his blood run cold. "What did you do?" The mother's expression faltered, and for a moment, she looked like she might break down. Then, her eyes hardened. "We were going to take everything down with us. We were going to destroy the evidence. The information is hidden in a place they'll never find. But my husband, he went too far." The father shook his head slowly, as if he still couldn't quite believe what had happened. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to make sure they couldn't come after us." The sergeant's voice was tight with disbelief. "You're telling me you planted explosives? In the town? In the government buildings?" The father looked away, his face crumpling with shame. "I didn't know what else to do. They were going to come for us. They were going to destroy us if we didn't stop them first." At that moment, the sergeant's radio crackled to life, a sharp, urgent voice cutting through the silence. "Sergeant, you need to hear this. We've got reports of a security breach at City Hall. Something's not right." The sergeant's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He barked into the radio. "Security cameras are down. There's movement in the lower levels. It looks like someone's tampering with the system. We've sent backup, but it's bad, sir." His mind went blank for a moment as he realized the full scope of the situation. The father had confessed he had planted explosives in the town. But the real horror was yet to come. They had planned to take down the corrupt system from within, but now it seemed that their plan was no longer under control. "Get everyone out of the area," the sergeant ordered, his voice sharp. "We need to evacuate the town immediately." As the radio crackled and the officers scrambled into action, the sergeant turned back to the family, his heart sinking. "You two are coming with me," he said, motioning for the boy's parents. "We're going to have to stop this, or it's going to be too late for all of us." But just as they turned to leave, a final twist shattered everything. From behind them, there was the soft click of a door closing, and a voice rang out sharp and clear. "I wouldn't move if I were you." The sergeant spun around, his eyes widening as a new figure stepped into the doorway. It was a man, one of the people the father had mentioned earlier. But this man wasn't an officer. He was far too calm, far too calculated. His eyes were cold, and the smirk on his face said it all. "I'm afraid your time's up," he said softly. "And the truth about everything is about to come out." The sergeant's mind raced, but before he could react, the man stepped forward, pulling a small device from his pocket. The flick of a switch echoed in the room, and the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. And that was when the explosion rocked the town. The deafening roar of the explosion shook the town like a living beast, its force rattling the walls of the police station. The lights flickered out, plunging everyone into an unsettling, suffocating darkness. For a moment, there was silence broken only by the sharp breaths of those caught in the chaos. The kind of silence that makes you question if you've been struck deaf. And then, the ringing began, a high-pitched sound that seemed to carry on forever, making it hard to think, to move, to even breathe. The town was under attack. The explosion had set off a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. The sergeant's heart pounded as he fumbled for his flashlight, his mind racing, trying to put the pieces together. What was this man, this unknown figure who had stepped in just moments before the explosion? And what did he mean by the truth is about to come out? The words echoed in his ears as he scanned the room, trying to make sense of the situation. The boy, who had been clutching his mother tightly, was now crying out in fear. "Mom, what's happening? Where are we?" His voice was barely audible over the lingering shockwave of the explosion. His mother, equally disoriented, pulled him close. "We have to go. We have to get out of here," she whispered, her own voice trembling. She was panicking now, and it was easy to understand why. They were in the middle of a disaster, with no clear path to safety. The sergeant, his own mind spinning, forced himself to focus. He needed to find out what was happening, who was behind this, and what the next steps were. But the questions weighed heavily on him. Who had planted the bomb? What did the father know, and what role did the mysterious man play? And most importantly, why had the boy been so desperate to rush to the police station earlier, yelling that his father needed to be arrested? It was clear now that the situation was far more complex than anyone had first imagined. His flashlight flickered to life, casting a pale beam across the room. The mother and son were huddled together, trying to make sense of the chaos. The father, who had been at the center of the entire mess, was nowhere in sight. Had he been caught in the explosion? Or had he managed to slip away in the confusion? "Stay here," the sergeant ordered, though his voice was weak, barely audible over the sound of the distant sirens and the growing tumult in the streets. He had to find the answers. They were slipping through his fingers like sand. He took one last look at the boy and his mother, giving them a reassuring nod before heading towards the exit, the flashlight illuminating the dark, debris-strewn hallway. The town was in complete disarray. The streets outside the police station were littered with rubble, the sounds of fire alarms, and the distant cries of panicked citizens filled the air. The explosion had torn through City Hall, a symbolic landmark of the town, and now the town was under lockdown, as authorities scrambled to control the damage. It wasn't just an attack on the building, it was an attack on the entire system, the very fabric of the community. The sergeant's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, scanning the incoming message. It was a report from his officers, detailing the chaos at City Hall and the aftermath of the explosion. The building had sustained serious structural damage, and there were casualties. But that wasn't the worst of it. It was the list of names. Several key officials from the town's local government were now listed as missing. Names the sergeant recognized, people he'd worked with, trusted. All of them had been in the building when the explosion hit. It wasn't just an attack on a building, it was a direct assault on the town's leadership. But as he continued reading, something stood out. Among the names listed was the very man who had stepped into the room just before the explosion. The man who had warned them all that the truth was about to come out. The man who had said that the town was under attack from within. The sergeant's stomach dropped as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The explosion wasn't a random act of violence. This was no isolated incident. It was a planned attack, set in motion by people who were determined to expose the very system that had been controlling the town for decades. And they weren't just trying to bring down a few corrupt officials, they were trying to dismantle everything. It was the truth that had been buried so deep, no one wanted to look. Corruption, lies, secret deals, and betrayals, it had all been hidden in plain sight for years. And now it was finally being brought to light. The sergeant ran back inside the building, his flashlight casting long shadows along the walls. He needed to find the boy's father and get to the bottom of this. He needed to understand what had happened and why the father had felt it necessary to put everyone's lives in danger. But more than that, he needed to understand what the mysterious man had meant when he said the truth was about to come out. As he turned the corner into the main hallway, The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark again. He could hear the faint echo of footsteps in the distance, but they didn't sound like they belonged to the officers. "Sergeant!" A voice called out from the darkness, and the sergeant quickly spun around, his flashlight shining across the hallway. It was the father. He was standing at the far end, a look of desperation in his eyes. "You need to stop this," the man said, his voice low but urgent. "It's too late now. The damage is done. We can't fix it." The sergeant's heart raced. "You planted those explosives," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You put everyone in danger." The father shook his head, his face pale in the flashlight's beam. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to protect my family, to protect my son. And you think this destruction is going to protect anyone?" The sergeant was nearly shouting now. "What were you trying to accomplish?" "I was trying to stop them," the father said, his voice cracking. "The people who've been running this town, the ones who've been pulling the strings for years, they've been using us, controlling us, and they've been covering up their crimes. We were going to expose them." The sergeant's mind was racing. And the boy? Why did he say what he did? Why did he run to the police station, screaming to arrest you? The father's expression shifted, guilt and fear overwhelming his face. He doesn't know the whole truth. He wasn't supposed to find out. He was just a kid. He's been through enough already. I didn't want him to know what I had to do. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "But why now? Why did you wait until it was too late to stop all of this?" "I couldn't wait anymore," the father whispered, his voice barely audible. "The walls were closing in. They were going to come after us, come after him. I had to make sure we were safe." As the father spoke, the sergeant heard the distant rumble of sirens growing louder. The authorities were closing in. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were at the heart of a catastrophe, and there was no easy solution. The boy's mother suddenly appeared behind him, her face a mask of terror. She reached out to the father, her voice breaking as she spoke. "We can't keep running," she said. "We can't keep hiding from this. We have to face it now." The father looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered, "but I didn't know how far this would go." The sergeant watched them, his mind struggling to find a way to fix this. He knew the truth was out there, hidden in the debris of the explosion and the chaos that followed. But with the town in ruins, and the people who had been responsible for the explosion now scattered and lost, there was no easy path forward. And then, as if in answer to his unspoken thoughts, the boy spoke again, his small voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Maybe we can still fix this," he said, his eyes wide and full of hope. "Maybe we can still save everyone." The sergeant looked down at the boy, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to rebuild if they could uncover the truth, and if the people who were responsible could be held accountable. But that would take more than just a few answers. It would take a complete dismantling of the system. As the explosion's aftershocks faded and the dust began to settle, the sergeant realized that the real journey was only beginning. They had survived the first wave, but there was still so much more to uncover. The truth had come out, but it was just the beginning of a long road. And as they walked out into the streets of the shattered town, they carried with them the weight of everything that had been lost. And everything that might still be saved.